Hello, welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. In this video, I'm looking at a very famous Viking leader, one who was king of Dyflin, or Dublin as it is now, controlling much of the lucrative slave trade, of which Dyflin was the hub, was a leading figure in the great heathen army that conquered most of Britain in the 9th century, was known as a great warrior, and features very prominently in a modern television show. Not that he would probably recognize himself if he could come back to our own time and see it. He certainly wouldn't recognize the costumes. I'm talking about Ivarr in Beinlausi, or Ivarr the Boneless. There are some things to be borne in mind, however, with regards to Ivarr and his brothers. He is a historical figure, we know that, but we can't always be sure as to certain specific details about him or his brothers, because for one thing, they are often mentioned by various names, which we assume refer to them, variations of their own names or names other people call them. So some confusion there is possible. For example, Ivarr is referred to in various places as hinn, Ingur, Ingwar, Ívarr, Ímar, and Igwar. A lot of his story is based on interpretation of the historical record, if you like, which we hope is correct, but we can't always be certain. So what follows is what seems to be the most likely series of events based on those interpretations being correct. While we know that he was a genuine historical figure, there is a lot about him that is still a mystery, and as well as various versions of his name, conflicting accounts, often contradicting other accounts, even from his own time, don't help matters. Now, he was said to be the son of the great hero Ragnar Sigurdsson, better known as Ragnar Lothbrok, and he had a number of brothers, the principal ones being Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, Uber, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Hvitserk. Now, there's a problem right away, because Ragnar Lothbrok didn't actually exist. Not as such. He seems to have been no more than a saga character, based on several important Viking leaders whose genuine deeds were attributed to Ragnar. So, if he didn't exist, his having children seems a bit, well, a bit unlikely from a biological point of view. But we know that 4 of the brothers do appear to have been genuine historical characters because they are mentioned in historical documents rather than just in sagas or the retelling of those sagas in the 13th century. Ivar, Halfdan, Uber, and Bjorn Ironside are actual historical figures, though the others, well, we really can't be sure. They may well be fictional characters. A little bit more about Ragnar is in order before we proceed. To begin with, his name was not Lothbrok. That was a nickname, meaning hairy breeches, from a special pair of breeches that he was supposed to have worn, soaked in tar to protect him from the venom of a giant serpent, which he killed, winning the hand in marriage of his first wife, Thora. Now, many Norsemen, of course, were known by a popular nickname rather than their actual surname. Bjorn Ironside, Harald Finehair, Gorm the Old, Eric Bloodaxe, for example. And Ragnar's real name was Sigurdsson, and his sons would have had the name Ragnarsson. It has been suggested that a Jarl, who was supposed to be named Ragnar, who was said to have been the leader who attacked the city of Paris in 845 AD and was paid by the Frankish king to go away, was Ragnar Lothbrok. But there is no evidence that the particular man in question was ever known by that nickname, nor was anyone else other than in the sagas. Plus the fact that the breeches that resulted in the Lothbrok nickname were so called because they had helped the great hero to overcome a giant serpent. And well, giant serpents were not really a great problem in Scandinavia during the 9th century, or indeed anywhere else for that matter, making Ragnar Lothbrok himself actually being a real person rather unlikely, nor did the Ragnar who raided Paris ever perform a similar feat while wearing tar-soaked breeches and win a wife, and thus that gentleman could hardly have claimed the nickname even had he wanted to. For fans of the Vikings TV show, I'm sorry if this bursts a romantic bubble and spoils the whole thing for you, I must point out that Ragnar Lothbrok was never married to Lagertha. His first wife was Thora, as we've seen, and after her death he married Osla. Now, nor was she shot in the back with an arrow by Lagertha or anyone else. And in fact, in the sagas, she is painted as quite a warrior herself, leading an army on one occasion to attack Sweden. So, why were the 4 brothers seen as the sons of a man who didn't actually exist outside of sagas and poems? I suppose the most likely explanation is that the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok was already well known, and the four brothers, and they were brothers in fact as far as we know, had a father called Ragnar. A Ragnar, of course, not the Ragnar, and thus their surname was Ragnarsson. And they simply used that fact to bolster their own importance, claiming a relationship with the great hero from the sagas, what today we would term trying to make themselves look more booyah. After all, who was going to argue with the son of Ragnar Lothbrok? Olafur the White became king of Dyflin circa 853 AD, and the first actual mention of Ivarr that we have, called by the Irish records as Ívarr, is 4 years later, in 857 AD, when he becomes joint king of Dyflin, reigning together with his kinsman Olafur, sharing the title the King of the Foreigners. Now, he got off to an aggressive start, which I suppose was understandable, Ivar being Ivar, ravaging County Meath to begin with, plundering Celtic tombs, such as those in the Boyne Valley, and he was involved in no little conflict with native Irish chieftains as a result, who were not too pleased with his activities, though he later made alliances with some of them, including Serbil, King of Ossory, so that he could leave Ireland and still have allies at his back rather than enemies. He had ambitions across the Irish Sea in Britain. So, following up on those ambitions, once he had secured some allies to hold the fort, if you like, behind him, he and Olafur left Dyflin in 865, along with Ivar's brothers, Uber and Halfdan, to head what the Anglo-Saxons referred to as the Great Heathen Army, along with a number of other Norse leaders, of course, such as Guthrum, Kettle, Harald, Sidrak, and Amund. The army composed of Danish, Norwegian, and Frisian Vikings, their intention being to conquer Anglo-Saxon Britain, and the Saxon historian Ethelred recorded that the fleets of the Viking tyrant Hingwar landed in England from the north, Hingwar being the most common Saxon name for Ivar. Since most of the great army landed initially in East Anglia, one must assume Ivar sailed around Scotland and down the North Sea. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Hingwar, Hubba, and Halfdene were the leaders of the great army, using their Saxon names. Olafur, however, returned to Dyflin fairly soon, leaving Ivar to carry on with the army. One frequently asked question is, how large was the great heathen army? Since in those times, even a small group of men might be referred to as an army. The law code of the Kingdom of Wessex, in fact, defined an army as comprising more than 35 men, which is not really much of an army. And even the fairly large military groups of the time were quite small by the standards of later medieval armies, or preceding ones for that matter, such as the Roman legions or the huge army of Alexander the Great. For a long time, it was assumed that the great army wasn't really all that great, perhaps 1,000 men, if that. But that never really took into account the number of battles they fought, losing a considerable number of men in each one. But they were still powerful enough each time a fresh Anglo-Saxon force arrived to take it on, which would seem to indicate a pretty large number, or at least a plentiful supply of reinforcements, which I suppose is really the same thing. But the small size of the great army's fortified camp at Repton on the River Trent, which is known as a Longport, seemed to agree with the opinion that the army could not have been very large. The camp was a D-shaped earthen rampart situated on the banks of the river, with the river itself forming the fourth wall, you might say, and incorporating a Christian church into the defences. But it really wasn't much larger than the churchyard had been, which would have indicated a small number of men, obviously, in such a small fort. But recent excavations at the Repton site have shown that the army was considerably larger than previously thought, and it also confirmed that women and children accompanied it, as we might expect from an army in those days. The fortified Longport actually was only a small part of the camp, which spread out across a huge area beyond it, something like 130 acres, with workshops and smithies, ship repair yards, and so on. And that discovery raised the size of the great army by several thousand, showing that this was the largest Viking force ever to land in England before Harald Sigurdsson's invasion in 1066, and indeed the largest invasion force from anywhere else, in fact, since the arrival of the Roman legions centuries previously. The Kingdom of East Anglia, a section of the English coast that juts out into the North Sea, was chosen quite deliberately, I'm sure, since it made a perfect landing place for ships coming down from Scandinavia, and it comprised the modern-day counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire, where King Edmund rather foolishly tried appeasement rather than resistance, deciding for some reason best known to himself not to strike them when they would have been at their weakest, coming ashore and establishing their force on land, wading through the water, carrying chests, helping the women ashore. I mean, they were vulnerable at that moment. Did he attack? No. Instead, he offered them horses in return for peace. Now, that probably seemed like a good idea at the time, but it wasn't. Ivar, of course, accepted the offer, I'm sure laughing to himself at the naivety of King Edmund, who had just allowed an invading force intent on conquest to land unopposed, thinking that some horses were going to keep him safe. As the American comedian Red Skelton used to say, he don't know me very well, do he? Anyway, the great army spent some time at Thetford before marching north. By November of 866, they reached the Anglo-Saxon trading city of Iorwerk, or modern-day York, in the kingdom of Northumbria, which they would rename Jorvik. Now, this was a very important city, located at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, which merged with other rivers before flowing down to the Humber and out into the North Sea, making it a thriving port and the access point to much of northern England. Control Jorvik and you control Northumbria, which comprised the whole of northern England, from a line between modern-day Grimsby to Liverpool and right up to Edinburgh and the west coast of Scotland, incorporating the former kingdom of Bernicia. Ivar and Halfdan attacked on the 1st of November, which happened to be All Saints' Day, a very important Christian festival which would be attended by everyone who was anyone. All important city leaders and officials, military commanders, prominent citizens would all be in the cathedral. And this may well have been the reason for the attack on that day, taking the city leaders by surprise when they would be disorganized. Military leaders would have to rush to their commands. It would certainly reduce the effectiveness of any defense. Of course, it could have been just a coincidence. But that does seem rather unlikely. The Vikings gathered information as they moved. They were quite good at that. And Ivar was noted for his military ability and cunning, so I'm sure he would have been very well aware of Christian festivals. In any case, the assault was fast and effective, and they captured the city, though the two kings who ruled in Northumbria, Eilar and Osbert, escaped. Taking the city gave the great army a dominance over most of northern England, right up to the Scottish border, and Jorvik would become a major centre of Norse occupation and trade for a couple of hundred years to come. The bulk of the army had left Jorvik to winter on the River Tyne, but with most of the force absent, there was an uprising against them in Jorvik, incited by, yes, you might have known, Eilar and Osbert, who had popped up once again and attempted to reconquer the city, forcing the great army to retake it in 867, which they did without too much difficulty, but in a far more violent and bloody battle than the one previously, during which the two kings were killed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recording that there was excessive slaughter made of the Northumbrians, after which Halfdan shared out the lands of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. Some 150 years later, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also stated that the Vikings rebuilt the city of York, cultivated the land around it, and remained there. Now, interestingly enough, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says nothing at all about King Eilar being executed in a particularly gruesome manner, nor the reason why that might even have been done, just that he was killed, something I'll come back to in a moment. Without any leadership, all resistance to the great army ceased, and a local puppet king, Egbert, was installed in Jorvik, though of course he had no actual power, and he was simply there to pass on orders from Ivar and the other Viking leaders and to collect taxes to further the great army. Later on, Halfdan Ragnarsson was named the first Norse king of Northumbria. Now, the legend of Ivar, of course, says that King Eilar was killed with the extremely unpleasant blood eagle, where someone's back was cut open, the ribs were smashed, and the lungs were pulled out and left hanging like the wings of a bird. And that was done in retaliation for his having thrown Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit of vipers. And in fact, that was the reason for Ivar and his brothers even being there in the first place. They weren't there to conquer anything, to get land. No, they were there to avenge the death of their father. Well, firstly, there is no mention of any such thing in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a pretty accurate record of events at that time, in which the monks wrote down just about everything of interest that occurred. Nor is it mentioned in the Irish annals, such as the Annals of Ulster. And I think chucking a great Viking leader into a pit of vipers would have got a mention. Had, of course, Ragnar Lothbrok actually existed in the first place in order to be chucked, and King Ívarr just happened to have a big pit full of vipers handy to chuck him into, which seems rather unlikely on both counts. It was also said in the legendary version that after the first battle, Ivar had come to an arrangement with King Ívarr that he would cease raiding if he was granted all the land that he could cover with the hide of an ox. Yes, the hide of an ox. And the king agreed. Now, to me, that suggests King Ívarr would have lost an IQ test to the village idiot. Because why would a great Viking warlord fight a battle just to gain enough ground to, well, make a bed on? Of course, the cunning Ivar cut the ox hide into such thin pieces that it stretched all the way around the city of Ívarr, thus enabling him to claim it as his, which was obviously impossible unless the ox was bigger than the largest elephant that had ever lived. But you know, this is very similar to tales from other lands, such as one from here in Ireland, where St. Bridget was said to have asked the King of Leinster, who was reluctant to give her anything at all, for as much land as her cloak could cover. The Irish king was obviously as dim-witted as Aile, and never suspected that there was something odd about the request for such a tiny bit of land, and he agreed. But Bridget, well, of course, she didn't lay it down. Excuse me. She gave the four corners of it to four of her nuns, and she told them to run towards all 4 points of the compass, the cloak expanding as they did so, covering many acres of land, and forcing the king to concede to her demands. Cut up ox hide, expanding cloak, it's pretty much the same story, and equally improbable. But to return to those things, it did actually happen. In 867, the great army marched into the kingdom of Mercia, capturing the city of Nottingham, where they spent the winter. King Burgred of Mercia requested assistance from King Ethelred of Wessex, who, along with his brother Alfred, the future King Alfred the Great, arrived with an army and laid siege to Nottingham. They failed to achieve anything, however, being unable to penetrate the defences, and Ivar had no intention of leaving the city to fight. He had no need to do so. Why leave the city to fight and take casualties when all he had to do was sit behind the walls in safety and wait till they went away? Now, not everyone saw it that way, of course. One Henry of Huntingdon, a chronicler writing some 250 years after the event, put it thus: Ingvar then, seeing that the whole force of England was there gathered, and that his host was the weaker, and was there shut in, betook himself to smooth words, cunning fox that he was, and won peace and troth from the English. Then he went back to York, and abode there for 1 year with all cruelty. King Burgred, seeing the stalemate, decided to buy the Vikings off, agreeing a truce with them that saw them return to Northumbria in the autumn of 868, where they remained, consolidating and gathering strength for their next campaign. That took them back again to East Anglia. Excuse me. The invasion of East Anglia was launched in 869, with the intention this time of full conquest. No peace deals in return for horses. Seizing the town of Thetford, King Edmund at last decided to put up a fight. There's a surprise. And he arrived with an army, but he was just as useless this time around as he had been the first time, and he was captured and killed. Following his death, Edmund was declared a martyr for the faith, since tradition said he had refused the Danish demands to renounce Christ, and that Ivar and Ubba were responsible for his death. One story being that he was shot full of arrows like Saint Sebastian, after telling the Norsemen how God had protected the saint. And Ivar decided to see if God would do the same for Edmund. He didn't. Edmund died somewhat resembling a pincushion. That's the legend. But exactly how he died in the battle or afterwards, we really don't know for certain. And what part Halfdan played in that event isn't mentioned. In the 10th century, a monk named Abba of Furli wrote that Edmund was hit with numerous what he calls javelins. And then, when Hingwar, the wicked seaman, saw that the noble king would not deny Christ, but with steadfast faith ever called upon him, he commanded men to behead him, and the heathen did so. For while he was yet calling upon Christ, the heathen drew away the saint to slay him, and struck off his head with a single blow, and his soul departed joyfully to Christ. Well, that's the story. By 870 AD, Ivar seems to have withdrawn from any participation in the further activities of the Great Army, since he renewed his partnership with his co-ruler in Dublin, Olafur the White, launching a two-pronged attack on Scotland, Ivar leading one group from York, while Olafur sailed up the Firth of Clyde with a considerable fleet, the two eventually joining forces at Dumbarton, the capital of the Britons of Strathclyde, or Strathclyde as it is today, which they besieged for 4 months, cutting off the garrison's water supply and forcing their surrender, after which they destroyed the fortress. The annals of Ulster saying that they besieged, razed, and pillaged it. They remained in Strathclyde for the winter and then returned to Dyflin in 871, loaded with booty and slaves, having exacted tribute from Constantine I, king of Alba, leaving Halfdan, Ubba, and Guthrum as the principal leaders of the Great Army, which over the next 7 years conquered almost all of England, with the exception of the Kingdom of Wessex, while Ivar continued to rule Dyflin after that time until his death, which according to both the Annals of Ulster and the fragmentary Annals of Ireland occurred in 873 AD. The Anglo-Saxon historian Ethelred gives his death as being in 870 AD, though that is clearly an error, since he was very much alive in that year raiding the Strathclyde, while another account has him dying in a shipwreck in 878, which seems highly unlikely. So I think we should go with the two annals. They both agree on it. Ivar left a considerable legacy, founding the greatest Viking dynasty in Ireland, or anywhere else for that matter, known as the Ívarr, meaning the descendants of Ivar, though that title included Ivar himself and his contemporaries. And there's no indication that he ever married or had children, so he had no direct descendants by blood, though the title would have referred to those around him as well. He would have been very wealthy, having derived considerable sums from the slave trade, there being enormous profits to be had both from the international trade in slaves itself, often sent as far as the slave markets of Francia and even further to Constantinople, and from the heavy taxes levied on it. Indeed, Dyflin became the principal slave trading centre in Western Europe, drawing the, merchandise, from the Irish hinterland as well as raids across the sea. Excavations in Dublin have uncovered numerous slave chains, iron neck rings linked together by chains that would have secured a number of slaves in a row, as well as individual iron neck collars, not the sort of fashion accessory one would really want. Ireland, incidentally, was one of the last places in Europe to give up the practice of slavery, despite the efforts of the church in later years to stop it. Ivar was described as the king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. A very modest title, to be sure, but he may actually have given to himself. I mean, why not? He deserved it. And he was considered a brilliant military strategist, something the television show does portray correctly. Now, the claim was not actually boastful. He could indeed include Britain in it, since the Norse kingdom of Dyflin included a considerable area along the west coast of Britain and Scotland, as well as the Hebrides, thanks to King Olafur's marriage to Aud Ketilsdottir, known as Aud the Deep Thinker, whose family controlled the Hebrides, and she would later become one of the greatest figures in the early history of Iceland, sailing to Iceland in her own ship and becoming a leading figure in the politics of that country. She is now a highly respected historical figure in Iceland. Now, whether or not Ivar was actually crippled to any great extent is a matter of debate, given his military prowess. And he was described as being a very large man, standing well above most others, and a capable warrior, as well as being very strong, cunning, and skillful. Ivarr in Beinlausi, Ivarr the Boneless. Well, there really is no way to give a definite answer, given the conflicting accounts of him. Nor are there any Anglo-Saxon reports of anyone ever meeting him and describing him physically, though I'm sure many Anglo-Saxons did meet him, and many were still alive afterwards. Of course, to talk about it is quite another matter. Some saga accounts describe him as having weak bones, cartilage instead of bone, or in fact no bones at all, which of course is a medical impossibility because having no bones would leave him more or less a big lump of jelly, and being carried on a shield, which, though that sounds plausible at first sight, would actually have been very awkward as a method of transport, especially for such a large man, and a positive hazard in battle, making it questionable to say the least, since Viking shields were round and not overly large, and they certainly were not designed for carrying very big men around on them, which frankly would have been all but impossible, other than perhaps helping to drag a wounded man off the battlefield. Get a typical Viking shield and put a big man like, say, Jason Momoa on it, and see how you get on. Now, victorious leaders would sometimes be lifted up and carried on enemy shields as a sign of victory, but that was just for a very brief time. And they would not have tried to go into battle in that manner, nor to be carried around like that as a usual method of transport, making that rather unlikely in Ivar's case. I mean, he is described as firing his bow, for example, while being carried around. A hard thing to do while sitting on a shield. He could, of course, actually have been carried not on shields, but in a litter of some sort. But once again, that hardly sounds like a great warrior of the 9th century who men would willingly follow into battle. And again, trying to accurately hit something with a bow while being carried in a litter, well, that would have been a bit of a challenge, to put it mildly. Now, yes, he could have had weak bones, I suppose. There are medical conditions that would make standing or walking difficult. And if he was exceedingly tall, that could increase any bone problems he might have, such as the tallest man that we know of who ever lived, Robert Pershing Wadlow, who was almost 9 feet tall, and he needed metal braces on his legs to walk. A bit like Ivarr, the TV show, actually. But such a condition in the Viking Age, where strength and fighting ability were so greatly regarded, would hardly enable someone to become a great warlord. Now, interestingly enough, in the Ragnar Lothbrok, the tale of Ragnar's sons, it is suggested that male impotence was the problem with Ivar, that his bonelessness was simply figurative, an early play on the term boner for an erection. And in that case, tales of his physical handicap may well have been an attempt to hide the fact. Since for any Norseman, and especially a great, famous warrior like Ivar Ragnarsson, being impotent would be a considerable embarrassment, and could call the succession of any children he might have into question, not that he actually had any. The 13th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, writing in his Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, doesn't even mention any physical defect with Ivar. And as I've said, it's highly questionable that a severe physical deformity such as lack of bones would have allowed him to become a great leader in that day and age. In fact, he would have been lucky to even survive childhood. Now, another suggestion, and quite a plausible one, is that he was extremely flexible in movement, moving as though he had no bones in his body, rather the way a cat moves, or a hamster, seeming to have no bones in it and able to flatten itself and slide under a door. What in his case today we might call double jointed. Now that seems to me to be quite likely, and later writers, relying after all on verbal tales handed down from mouth to mouth, since the Old Norse didn't write things down and the sagas and poems weren't written until the 13th century, they could have misunderstood or misinterpreted the verbal tales, themselves already probably distorted by constant retelling. The only contemporary written records are those such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or some of the Irish annals, such as the Annals of Ulster. Even the likes of Saxo are writing down the old stories hundreds of years later. And if you wrote down something your grandfather told you that his father had said he was told by his father, who'd got it from his grandfather, whose great aunt had heard it from somebody or other, I don't think you'd actually have a very accurate record of what was actually said. Now, the reason for his deformity, according to Ragnar's saga, was that his mother, Aslak, who was of Volva, had told Ragnar that he must wait 3 days before having intercourse with her after he had returned from a raid, or else there would be repercussions. She said, 3 nights together, but yet apart shall we bide, nor worship the gods as yet. From my son this would save a lasting harm, for boneless is he thou wouldst now beget. But Ragnar, having been away from her for some time and suffering the sexual withdrawal symptoms so often associated with seafarers, couldn't restrain himself from begetting, and he bedded her right there and then. The result was baby Ivar with wonky legs. The saga saying, the boy was boneless, as if there were gristle where his bones should be. When he was young, he was grown so large that no one was his equal. He was the handsomest of all men, and so wise that it wasn't certain whether there had ever been a wiser man than him. Well, the things about his size and wisdom may have been true, but that a baby so handicapped would have been allowed to live is highly unlikely, even if he were the son of an important man. In fact, possibly more so. Who would probably not want his importance to be lowered by such an offspring, a child who could be seen even as a punishment from the gods for something, or as a reflection on his sexual prowess that produced such a crippled child. And a child's chances of ever becoming a great leader of men, and a king to boot, would have been rather slim, even if he survived to be able to do so. Though Ivar did exist, unlike Ragnar Lothbrok, and his brothers Bjorn Ironside, Halfdan, and Ubba are also historical figures. There are numerous references to them. Ubba, for example, we know took part in the Battle of Sinwyd in Devonshire, or Devonshire as it is today, in 878 AD, when he was killed by Oda, the ealdorman of Devon. A great deal of Ivar's story is unfortunately partly historical fact and partly saga storytelling, which may or may not be correct, especially the idea of his bonelessness as some form of physical deformity, since some aspects of that seem to contradict other aspects of it. Now, a lot of saga material is perfectly factual, but a great deal is also either highly romanticized or total fiction. Stories for entertainment or educational purposes rather than a genuine record of historical events. I have tried to follow, for the most part, the things about him that can be related to known historical facts, rather than some of the tales of him in the sagas, which are nice stories, but can't be verified by historical record, and are sometimes far too lurid and improbable to be anything but just that, nice stories. For example, one tale has him meeting the king of Sweden in battle, but the Swedish king has a secret weapon. Oh yes, a magic cow. Yes, yes, you heard correctly, a magic cow. And this fearsome beast is decimating Ivar's men. So he tells his warriors to make an enormous bow using a large tree. Then, sitting on the shield he's riding on, he draws the tree bow as if it were a flimsy elm twig, and he shoots the cow with it, hitting her in the face and blinding her. Where they got a huge bowstring and a suitable arrow, I don't know, but they did. The cow is mightily pissed off about that. That's what would be. And she goes on a great rampage. But Ivar has a backup plan. Oh, yes. He tells his men to throw him at the cow. Yes, lift him up and throw him, which they do, and his great size crushes the unfortunate cow. The warriors pick him up, stick him back on his shield, and he addresses his army. His voice so powerful that every man hears him as clearly as if he was standing shoulder to shoulder with them. An exciting tale, to be sure. And also a total load of horseshit. Well, in this case, cow dung. So too probably is the famous story of King Aelle being killed by Ivar and his brothers with the dreadful punishment known as the blood eagle, where someone's lungs are supposed to be pulled out of their back, since the Anglo-Saxon chronicle makes no mention of it. And had a Saxon king been pulled apart by nasty Norsemen, I'm sure they would have, even if only for some good old anti-Viking propaganda. The blood eagle in itself is actually highly questionable from a historical point of view. A lot of scholars think that it didn't actually exist, other than in a legendary form. Regardless of whether he was the product of uncontrollable sexual desire and couldn't walk properly, or simply couldn't get it up, as they say, whether he was or was not carried on a shield, we know enough about him to say that he was a remarkable man, a great military leader, and a commanding figure in the history of both Ireland and Britain, and probably deserves his status as one of the most famous Viking leaders. So, I hope you enjoyed that, and all that remains now is for me to say farewell, goodbye, until next time.